The quiet streets of Willow Creek erupted into chaos the moment 3 police cars screeched to a halt in front of Helen Carter's house. Neighbors peeked through curtains, phones in hand, whispering about what crime she could have possibly committed. The HOA president stood proudly at the curb, convinced he had finally crushed the rule breaker once and for all. But inside, Helen remained calm, too calm, as if she knew something no one else did. Within seconds, the officer's expressions shifted from authority to shock, and what happened next would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. The sun dipped low over Willow Creek, a pristine suburban neighborhood where every blade of grass was trimmed to perfection and every house looked like it had leapt straight off a magazine cover. From a distance, it was paradise-wide tree-lined streets, white picket fences, friendly smiles, and the promise of peaceful living. But behind the manicured lawns and cheerful mailboxes, there was a quiet, unspoken tension lurking in the shadows. A fragile balance controlled by the Homeowners Association, the HOA. For most residents, life here followed a simple rhythm: work, family dinners, weekend barbecues, and evening walks where neighbors nodded politely but rarely ventured beyond small talk. Yet beneath the surface, there were rules, hundreds of them. Rules about paint colors, grass height, mailbox size, fence height, holiday lights, pet breeds, and even the length of curtains visible from the street. And the man ensuring every single rule was followed: Greg Mason, the HOA president. But this story isn't about Greg. It's about Helen Carter, the woman Greg should never have underestimated. Helen had moved into Willow Creek 2 years earlier with her husband Mark and their 10-year-old daughter Lily. To anyone passing by, Helen seemed like the picture of suburban tranquility. Mid-40s, calm and graceful, always smiling politely at neighbors while tending to her immaculate front yard. But behind that quiet demeanor, Helen was a woman who had endured more battles than most people could imagine. After serving 15 years as a tactical instructor for local police department, she had retired early to focus on her family and her passion, gardening. It wasn't just a hobby, it was her therapy, her way of turning silence into beauty. Her backyard was her sanctuary, filled with roses, peonies, orchids, and rare exotic flowers she sourced from across the country. Her front lawn, framed by a small flower bed, had become something of a local attraction. To Helen, gardening wasn't just about aesthetics, it was freedom. In a world where rules, chaos, and violence had defined so much of her past, her flowers gave her a sense of control, her way of bringing peace into her life. And for the first year, Willow Creek felt like exactly what she'd been looking for: quiet, safe, perfect. Until Greg Mason decided it wasn't. Greg Mason was everything Helen wasn't. Loud, controlling, and obsessed with power, he wore his HOA title like a badge of honor. A man in his late 50s with a perfectly combed silver beard and an endless collection of polo shirts, Greg believed Willow Creek's perfection existed because of him. To Greg, every cracked driveway, every misplaced trash can, and every out-of-season decoration was an attack on the sanctity of the community he claimed to protect. The HOA board feared him. Most homeowners despised him, but few dared to challenge him. Greg was the kind of man who weaponized the rulebook. Missed a quarterly HOA payment by a single day? Expect a late fee. Placed your garbage bin on the curb before the approved 7 p.m. time frame? That's a $250 violation. Built a small storage shed without prior architectural approval? Prepare for a cease and desist letter. The worst part? Greg relished conflict, and Helen's passion for gardening had just landed her squarely in his sights. Willow Creek wasn't just another suburb, it was a stage. The residents were the audience, and the HOA was the director. Neighbors noticed everything, whispered about everything, and documented everything. On any given morning, Helen could feel the quiet stares as she planted new flowers. Mrs. Jennings, the elderly woman 2 doors down, would stand on her porch, sipping coffee, peeking over the rim of her mug. Across the street, the Patels often exchanged subtle glances whenever an HOA violation notice showed up in someone's mailbox. People saw Greg's tyranny. They knew his obsession with absolute control. But fear kept them silent. And it wasn't just fear of fines, it was fear of targeting. Once you crossed Greg, you weren't just another homeowner, you became an example. It started small. One warm Saturday morning, Ellen was on her knees planting lavender along the edge of her flower bed when she noticed a crisp white envelope tucked under her doormat. Inside, in bold black letters, it read, OIA, Notice of Violation, Unauthorized Property Alteration. Helen's eyes narrowed. Unauthorized. For planting flowers? She flipped the page and found Greg's signature at the bottom, along with a grainy photograph of her flower bed taken without her knowledge. The violation? Her flower bed extended 2 inches past the HOA's property boundary. 2 inches. At first, Helen laughed it off, assuming it was a mistake. But then she saw the fine, $500. Her smile faded. By Monday morning, whispers were already circulating. At the mailbox cluster, 2 neighbors murmured quietly until they spotted Helen approaching, then quickly changed the subject. Everyone knew what it meant to get a notice from Greg Mason. You could fight the HOA, but it came at a cost. Endless paperwork, harassment letters, surprise inspections, even anonymous complaints that just happened to surface against you. Helen tried to ignore it. She adjusted her flower bed, moving the stones slightly inward, and sent Greg a polite email explaining she had complied. But Greg wasn't interested in compliance. Greg wanted submission. A week later, another envelope arrived. This time, the fine had grown to $1,500. Greg claimed her mailbox didn't meet community-approved dimensions, even though it was the same size as every other mailbox on the block. Helen felt the anger rising in her chest, but Mark urged her to let it go. This is how he wins, he reminded her. If you fight him, he'll make it worse. But Helen wasn't wired to back down. Years of training officers to stay calm under pressure had taught her to assess, adapt, and act. And she could see Greg for what he was, a bully hiding behind paperwork. Still, she chose patience. For now. For the next few weeks, Helen kept to herself. She spent mornings trimming her roses, afternoons with Lily in the backyard, and evenings watching the sunset from her porch. She waved politely to neighbors, who waved back with hesitant smiles, as though they were quietly waiting for the next battle to begin. Greg, meanwhile, watched her like a hawk. He drove past her house twice a day, slowing his car enough to make his presence known. Sometimes she'd spot him parked at the far end of the cul-de-sac, pretending to check his phone, but clearly taking photos. There was an energy building in Willow Creek, thick and tense like the humid air before a summer storm. The tipping point came at the monthly HOA board meeting. The small clubhouse was filled with the usual mix of bored homeowners and power-hungry board members. But that night, Greg made his move. He stood at the front of the room, cleared his throat, and began reading from a printed statement. Well, it has come to the board's attention that Helen Carter has repeatedly violated community standards, despite multiple warnings. As such, I am proposing immediate escalation, including legal action if necessary. The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Even for Greg, this was extreme. Helen, seated near the back, locked eyes with him. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet calculation, the look of someone far more dangerous than Greg realized. She didn't speak, didn't defend herself. She simply stood, gathered her notes, and walked out without a word. Greg took her silence as victory. He would regret that mistake. That night, as Helen sat on her porch, sipping tea, a distant rumble of thunder rolled through the air. A summer storm was coming, but the real storm was brewing inside Willow Creek. Helen had spent her entire life solving problems under pressure, training tactical teams to handle hostage crises and high-risk operations. She'd walked into rooms where the wrong decision could cost lives, and she'd never once hesitated. Greg Mason thought she was just another suburban homeowner with a flower obsession. He had no idea who he was provoking. And when he made his next move, it would be the one that shattered the fragile peace of Willow Creek forever. The days following the HOA meeting felt different. Willow Creek had shifted. Neighbors no longer waved as warmly. Hushed whispers followed Helen wherever she went. and the envelopes began appearing in her mailbox like clockwork. At first, Helen thought it was paranoia, but soon the pattern was undeniable. Greg Mason wasn't done. He was just getting started. It began with a barrage of violation notices. The first claimed her driveway concrete was not HOA approved. The second accused her of planting non-native species in her backyard flowers. Greg couldn't even identify without Google. The third fined her $250 for having her garbage bin visible for 30 minutes past the approved curfew, even though Helen had proof it wasn't. Each envelope carried the same weight: frustration, intimidation, and humiliation. And Greg timed them perfectly, sending them every 3 days, ensuring Helen never had time to breathe between attacks. By the end of the second week, Helen had accumulated over $5,000 in fines, none of which were legitimate. Greg understood something most HOA presidents didn't: fear spreads faster than anger. He didn't need Helen to comply. He needed her isolated. Within days, rumors slithered through Willow Creek like smoke through cracks. At the local coffee shop, people whispered about Helen's trouble with the HOA. At the mailbox cluster, conversations stopped cold when she approached. Parents who once let their kids play in Lily's yard suddenly kept them away, afraid of getting involved. Helen noticed the looks, sideways glances, pitiful smiles, subtle avoidance. It wasn't just Greg anymore. It was the entire neighborhood turning against her. And Greg made sure of it. In his weekly HOA newsletter, he carefully worded community updates that highlighted Helen's multiple violations without naming her outright. But everyone knew who he meant. Her flower beds had become front-page gossip. One morning, Helen opened her mailbox to find a certified letter. Inside was a formal notice of intent to lien, a legal warning stating that, unless she paid her outstanding fines immediately, the HOA could place a lien on her home. The word lien hit like a gut punch. Greg wasn't just harassing her anymore. He was threatening her family's home. For Helen, the stakes had changed. What began as a dispute over 2 inches of flowers had become a fight for her family's security, and more importantly, her dignity. But Helen was no stranger to high-pressure situations. For years, she had trained SWAT teams to stay calm under fire, teaching officers to calculate, strategize, and execute when everything was on the line. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. This was war. Helen spent 3 nights combing through the HOA bylaws, a 147-page document Greg assumed nobody would ever bother to read. And buried deep on page 93, she found it. A clause stating that any landscaping within 3 feet of the property line required a formal written notice before fines could be issued. Greg had skipped that step entirely. Helen filed an appeal with the HOA Dispute Committee, attaching photographs, timestamps, and highlighted pages of the bylaws. 2 weeks later, the committee quietly dismissed the $500 flower bed fine. It wasn't much, just one victory against a mountain of harassment, but it was enough to shake Greg's confidence. For the first time, the emails stopped for a few days. The notices slowed. Helen could almost breathe. Almost. Greg didn't like losing, and Greg didn't forgive. The following Monday, Helen woke to find an inspector on her lawn, measuring the height of her grass with a metal ruler. That afternoon, another violation arrived. Grass height exceeds HOA standards. By Thursday, 2 more notices appeared, one accusing her of improperly stored gardening tools, and another claiming her front porch furniture was not architecturally consistent with community design. But this time, Greg escalated his tactics. Helen started receiving anonymous complaints, noise violations alleging disruptive gardening activity, security reports claiming she disturbed neighborhood peace, and even a bizarre accusation that she was operating a commercial nursery from her backyard. Greg was manufacturing evidence to force her into submission. Helen knew she had a strong case to appeal again, but this time Greg was ready. At the next board meeting, Helen presented her evidence calmly and methodically, but Greg had already spent the past week priming the board with concerns about Helen's refusal to cooperate. When she finished, the board members glanced nervously at Greg, avoided eye contact with Helen, and voted against her. It wasn't about facts anymore. It was politics. Helen walked out of that meeting with a pit in her stomach and a new understanding. Greg controlled the board, the newsletters, and half the neighborhood's loyalty. By now, Helen's name had become a neighborhood punchline. Neighbors stopped inviting her family to block parties. Cars slowed when passing her house, drivers craning their necks to peek at the troublemaker's yard. Some residents even crossed the street to avoid walking past her home. For Lily, it was worse. Her classmates' kids she used to play with after school started avoiding her. One afternoon, Helen overheard a group of children whispering loudly on the sidewalk. "That's the lady who's fighting the HOA." Lily cried that night, confused and hurt. That was the moment Helen's frustration hardened into resolve. Greg wasn't just threatening her flowers. He was trying to break her spirit, and now he was hurting her family. The final straw came on a humid Friday morning. Helen opened her mailbox expecting another violation. Instead, she found a certified packet stamped with bold red letters. HOA legal action. Eviction proceedings pending. Her hands trembled as she read the letter. The HOA claimed that her repeated non-compliance, the same manufactured violations Greg had orchestrated, was grounds for removal from the community. It was absurd. It was outrageous. And yet, it was real. That night, Helen sat at the kitchen table. The letter spread before her like a battle map. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge and Lily's soft breathing upstairs. For the first time since this started, Helen felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on her shoulders. Greg wanted her gone, and he was willing to drag her through the courts to make it happen. But Helen Carter wasn't wired to surrender. Not to anyone. Greg had one fatal flaw. He underestimated her. While Greg was busy weaponizing the HOA's power, Helen quietly prepared her own counterattack. She gathered every letter, every email, every violation notice, and built a meticulous timeline proving Greg's harassment and abuse of power. But she had something Greg didn't: connections. Years ago, during her time as a tactical instructor, Helen had trained dozens of police officers, including a few high-ranking ones still serving in the force. She made a few calls not for favors, but for information. Within days, she had what she needed: the HOA bylaws, state housing statutes, and a direct line to an attorney who specialized in homeowner rights against abusive HOAs. Helen wasn't fighting blind anymore. By the third month, tensions in Willow Creek had reached a boiling point. The once idyllic neighborhood had transformed into a battleground. Neighbors quietly chose sides, some openly supporting Helen's fight, others clinging to Greg's authority out of fear of retaliation. You could feel it in the air: the stiffness in polite greetings, the awkward silences at community events, the undercurrent of hostility brewing beneath fake smiles. And Greg, he grew bolder. He sent one final letter, short, cold, and deliberate. "Your continued defiance leaves us no choice. Law enforcement will be notified." That night, Helen stood on her porch as the humid summer wind carried the faint scent of rain. The streets were silent, the kind of silence that comes before chaos. She knew Greg was about to make his biggest move yet. She just didn't know when. 2 days later, the sound of screeching tires broke the calm of Willow Creek. 3 police cars pulled up in front of Helen's house. Neighbors poured onto porches. Phones started recording. And as Greg stood at the curb with folded arms, smiling like a man who believed victory was his, Helen Carter simply crossed her arms and waited. Because Greg Mason had made the worst mistake of his life. The storm broke on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. The neighborhood was buzzing with quiet tension, the kind of heavy silence that sits in the air right before lightning strikes. Birds stopped singing, curtains shifted, and the streets of Willow Creek were eerily empty until the first sound shattered it. Screeching tires. 3 black and white police cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing, sirens silent. Neighbors poured onto porches, cell phones already raised like rifles ready to capture a war. Within seconds, whispers spread like wildfire. "They're here for Helen." Greg finally called them. "This is going to get ugly." And standing at the curb, arms folded, chin raised high, was Greg Mason, the self-crowned ruler of Willow Creek. He had been waiting for this moment, the day he would publicly break Helen Carter once and for all. But Greg was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Helen stood calmly on her porch, the same porch Greg had driven past hundreds of times, measuring, photographing, nitpicking. But today she wasn't holding gardening gloves or pruning shears. She stood still, motionless, arms folded across her chest, watching the flashing lights illuminate the pristine street like a stage set for a final act. The lead officer stepped out, Officer Diaz, tall, broad-shouldered, and composed. Two more officers followed, hands resting lightly on their belts as they approached Greg. Every neighbor held their breath. Greg's voice carried across the cul-de-sac, loud and triumphant. "This is it! Get her out of here! She's been warned!" But Diaz didn't move toward Helen. He studied her, really studied her, and for the briefest moment, his face shifted. It wasn't authority. It wasn't intimidation. It was recognition. The seconds stretched like hours. Greg's smirk faltered as Diaz turned away from him and walked straight to Helen's porch. And then it happened, the twist Greg never saw coming. Officer Diaz stopped 2 steps away, removed his sunglasses, and nodded respectfully. "Oh." The neighbors froze. Greg's jaw went slack. Phones kept recording. Diaz turned his head slightly, his voice low but steady. "Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you here." Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence carried more weight than words ever could. Greg finally snapped, marching toward them. "What are you doing? Arrest her! She's in violation and she's broken every HOA rule we have." Diaz's gaze locked on him, cold, steady, unflinching. And in that silence, something shifted in the air. It was no longer Greg's show. Because Greg didn't know what everyone else was about to learn. Officer Diaz turned, his voice loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "Greg, do you know who Helen Carter is?" Greg blinked, confused, the question slicing through his arrogance. Diaz continued. "This woman trained every SWAT officer in this department, including me. If there's anyone in this city who understands the law, tactical procedure, and homeowners' rights better than the entire HOA board combined, it's her." Gasps erupted across the street. A neighbor dropped his phone. Mrs. Jennings whispered something under her breath. Greg's face went pale. Suddenly, the man who thought he controlled the entire neighborhood looked small. But Helen wasn't interested in theatrics. This wasn't about humiliating Greg in front of an audience. This was about ending his reign. She calmly handed Diaz a thick folder of evidence, a meticulously organized timeline of every violation notice, every fraudulent fine, every harassing email, and copies of state housing laws proving the HOA had grossly overstepped its authority. Inside that folder was also something Greg hadn't expected. A formal cease and desist order drafted by Helen's attorney, threatening a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and abuse of power if Greg didn't immediately withdraw the fines and retract every violation on record. Officer Diaz skimmed the first few pages, then turned to Greg. "Looks to me like you're the one in violation here." The crowd erupted in whispers again, phones capturing every moment, every shifting expression on Greg's face. For the first time in years, Greg Mason had no words. By the next day, the entire community was buzzing. Videos of the confrontation had already gone viral on local social media groups, shared hundreds of times with captions like, "HOA president humiliated in front of cops. She trained SWAT HOA, didn't see that coming." But the biggest fallout came at the next HOA board meeting. For the first time, the room was packed. Dozens of homeowners filled the chairs, lining the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder in the back. And they weren't quiet anymore. One by one, residents stood and voiced their anger, not at Helen, but at Greg. Years of silent resentment boiled over into loud, furious demands. "We're done with your bullying. You've been abusing your power for years. You almost got us sued." Helen didn't speak. She didn't need to. By the end of the meeting, the board called an emergency vote of no confidence. It wasn't even close. Greg Mason was removed as HOA president effective immediately. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But for Greg, it was only the beginning. But losing his title didn't sit well. Greg's identity, his entire sense of power, was tied to controlling Willow Creek. And now, not only had he lost his throne, but he'd been publicly humiliated, exposed, and outmaneuvered by the very woman he thought he could crush. So Greg did what desperate men do when their power slips away. He retaliated. Weeks later, Helen received a certified letter from Greg's personal attorney. Inside was a lawsuit. Greg Mason versus Willow Creek HOA board, Helen Carter. Greg was suing the board for wrongful removal, and Helen personally for defamation of character. It was absurd, baseless, but dangerous, because Greg wasn't fighting for fairness anymore. He was fighting for revenge. And for the first time, Helen realized something chilling. Greg wasn't just an HOA president with too much authority. Greg was a man willing to burn the entire neighborhood down if it meant regaining control. The legal battle hadn't even begun, but the first hearing was already scheduled. The entire community was talking. Lines were drawn, friendships fractured. And Greg had nothing left to lose. Helen had everything to protect. On the night before the court date, Helen stood in her garden beneath the soft hum of crickets, staring at her flowers swaying gently in the warm breeze. She had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Because what Greg did next would change everything. The sun dipped low over Willow Creek, painting the manicured lawns in a golden haze. For the first time in months, the air was still no shouting neighbors, no angry HOA patrols, no envelopes with hidden threats. Yet beneath that deceptive calm, an entire power structure had collapsed overnight. Helen Carter stood in her front yard, her hands trembling not from fear, but from relief. After months of intimidation, relentless fines, and calculated humiliation, the Homeowners Association had been dismantled from the inside out. And it all started the moment she unleashed her ace. When Helen revealed her hidden leverage documents exposing HOA President Richard Halverson's embezzlement and abuse of power, the board's control crumbled in days. Every fine, every warning letter, every legal threat the HOA had used against homeowners, all of it unraveled in the courtroom under flashing cameras and gasping reporters. The neighbors who once whispered behind Helen's back now looked at her differently, part fear, part admiration. Because when the truth spilled, it wasn't just about Richard misusing HOA funds. It turned out half the board had been quietly funneling homeowners' dues into secret accounts, funding their personal vacations, backyard renovations, and, in one shocking reveal, Richard's brand new Tesla Model S, the same Tesla he used to drive around the neighborhood, patrolling for rule breakers. Within 48 hours of Helen's legal ambush, Richard resigned under immense public pressure. But resignation wasn't enough. A class action lawsuit emerged. Backed by dozens of furious homeowners, Helen had quietly rallied together. Collectively, they demanded full restitution of every misused dollar. The board members, once untouchable kings and queens of Willow Creek, were suddenly dragged into depositions, grilled under oath, and forced to surrender years of financial records. By the third week, the HOA's bank account was frozen. By the fifth, subpoenas rolled in. And by the eighth, Willow Creek's entire HOA charter was dissolved. For the first time since the neighborhood was built, the residents were free. Free from arbitrary fines. Free from constant surveillance. Free from Richard's suffocating control. At first, Helen thought she'd finally get her quiet life back. No more fighting, no more courtrooms. No more late nights poring over legal documents while her coffee went cold. But something unexpected happened. The same neighbors who once doubted her now trusted her. They came to her yard one by one, thanking her, hugging her, offering cookies, wine, and heartfelt apologies. Her once troublesome house became a symbol of resistance. Some even begged her to lead a new homeowner-run council, a group designed to keep order without the power games and greed that destroyed the old HOA. Helen refused at first. She was tired, exhausted. But after everything Willow Creek endured, she knew walking away wasn't an option. If she didn't step up, someone like Richard would eventually rise again. And so with hesitation, she accepted. The downfall of the HOA had ripple effects far beyond Helen's personal victory. Property values soared without constant fines and litigation threats. Buyers flooded the market, seeing Willow Creek as a rare haven in a world where HOAs usually reign supreme. New friendships formed. Formerly divided neighbors now bonded over their shared survival story, transforming backyard gossip sessions into genuine support networks. Safety improved. Without Richard's HOA patrols, residents installed community-driven security measures, creating a safer, more collaborative environment than ever before. But it wasn't just victories and celebrations. For some homeowners, the damage ran deep. Richard's aggressive fines had forced multiple families into debt, foreclosures, and even bankruptcy. While Helen helped spearhead a fund to recover stolen HOA dues, not everyone could rebuild overnight. And then there were the loyalist neighbors who had defended Richard to the bitter end, convinced Helen was the villain. They watched her success from their porches in silence, resentment simmering beneath polite smiles. One in particular, Pamela Reese, Richard's closest ally on the board, quietly sold her house and disappeared overnight. Rumor had it she fled after draining her savings to settle lawsuits. But there were whispers Helen couldn't ignore, that Pamela wasn't done seeking revenge. Despite the lingering tensions, Helen finally reclaimed something she thought she'd lost forever: peace. For the first time in years, she woke up without dread. No stacks of legal threats waiting in the mailbox. No HOA inspectors circling her property like vultures. No more whispered accusations about her family's disrespect for community rules. Her garden, once a point of contention, bloomed brighter than ever, roses twisting across white fences, hydrangeas spilling into perfect rows, and a small stone fountain trickling softly under the afternoon sun. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a monument to survival. Just when the neighborhood settled into its new normal, a sealed letter arrived at Helen's doorstep. No return address, no markings, just her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one chilling line, typed in all caps. "This isn't over." No signature, no explanation. But Helen didn't need one. She knew exactly who sent it: Mayor Pamela Reese. And if Pamela was back, then this wasn't the end of the story. In the end, Helen Carter didn't just defeat the HOA. She changed the rules of the game. Her victory sparked whispers far beyond Willow Creek. Homeowners from other states began reaching out, asking how she did it, wanting to dismantle their own abusive HOAs. Helen had unknowingly become a symbol of rebellion, an inspiration to thousands trapped under corrupt neighborhood boards. But power, once threatened, never dies quietly. And as Helen stood on her porch, gripping the letter with trembling hands, one thought kept echoing in her mind. What happens when the villain you defeated decides to fight back? Because in Willow Creek, every ending hides another beginning.